Mark, Holly, Larry, thank you for joining us this morning. I want to start with a softball, but of course it's a hard choice on you, so hopefully it'll come out in the wash. Holly, I'm giving you an invisible magic wand. You get to choose one person, state, federal, could be Xi Jinping if you want to, and you can convince them of one thing. You can change their mind about one thing that they hold. Who do you choose, and what do you want to change their mind about?
Jeff Sessions. Criminal justice reform. More specifically, I'd certainly love to change his mind about sentencing reform. And I hope to have a robust discussion about that today.
So I want to ask a version of that question to you, Larry. One of the interesting parts of this conversation that we're having this morning is, in many ways, some of the points of tension. Each of you, Mark, Holly, Larry, each of you has been active within conservative politics and is a leader within conservative politics, broadly construed. But within issues of criminal justice, incarceration, justice, many of the immediate points of tension and disagreement seem to be within a conservative coalition. And so, Larry, I am curious for your thoughts on a similar question. If you could change your co-panelist's mind about one thing, what would you try to convince them of?
Probably several things. It'd be hard to pick one, but I have to say, to begin, in order to keep my job as an assistant United States attorney, that nothing I say here today should be considered the position of my office of the Eastern District of Virginia or the Department of Justice. I'm solely here as president of the National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys. I'm sorry I had to burden you with that, but I do want to stay employed. I think what I'd like to convince people of is that there's a lot of confusion in conflating the federal system of justice and the state system of justice. And while there are problems in both systems, and we should always strive as a country to make our systems of justice better and fairer, the idea that what the state system is doing is put on the federal system is just not fair to the federal system and inaccurate in many ways. So I'd like to convince my colleagues here that they should focus where the real problem resides. And the real problem, I think, resides not at the federal level, but at the state level. That doesn't mean to say there aren't things we can do and improve the federal system of justice. There certainly are.
So the last
We're built out in 17 states, by the way. So
yes.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to the matter of state policy, particularly given that in our earlier conversation we stayed pretty much on the federal level, but state and local policy is a huge, obviously the much bigger part of this issue. But Mark, I wanted to come to you with the last version of the trifecta, and I wanted to ask you, if you could change Larry's mind about one thing, what would that be?
Well, I haven't heard Larry's position on all the different issues that we'll probably talk about, and it sounded like he left kind of cracking the door open for some reforms in what he just said. What I'd say is that we should learn a lot from the last 3 decades, the 1980s and 1990s. I love those decades. I had a lot of hair. I could dunk a basketball. Life was good. I worked in a prison back then, and when I was out of high school, and a bunch of my friends were locked up, and some of their lives were ruined forever for drug offenses. And I think that we've learned a lot the last 2 decades about what does and what doesn't work with regard to what the states are doing and how you can both reduce crime rates and reduce incarceration rates at the same time and treat people individually. And particularly when we talk about the war on drugs, there's definitely a criminal element there that needs to be dealt with, but then there's a mental health component, and then there's a public addiction, public health issue as well. And a country as great as ours and a system as great as ours, we should be able to differentiate, and I'd like to see that happen.
So now I want to come back to this matter of how we define this conversation and this question. And Holly, I want to start with you. I'm going to ask each of you, one of the advantages of conversations like this is that each of you gets to go places and talk to folks and has relationships with them that the rest of us don't get to. I want to take advantage of that for a conversation. Holley, you spend a lot of time in states, working with leaders in states, working with members of your network who are advancing criminal justice policy at the state and local level. And what are you seeing, I think, particularly within conservative states, within red states? Where are you seeing red states leading the way on policy prerogatives that you would just click a button and spread across the nation if you could?
Well, certainly red states have, I think, have had the most success with criminal justice reform. You look at a state like Georgia, you look at a state like Texas, a state like Kentucky. Those are the states that have led the way, and it's the conservative governors who are so incredibly passionate about these issues. Governor Matt Bevin, good friend of mine and of Mark's, is all over the country right now talking about the need for reform. And I would say he's probably the most aggressive governor in the United States. Is Governor Malloy still here? He's probably the most aggressive governor in the United States on criminal justice policy. But I do want to start by talking about an issue that is gaining momentum in the states, and it's issues related to incarcerated women. Last year in my home state, the male incarcerated population grew by 5%. The female side grew by 14%. And if we're not careful, we're going to have an epidemic on our hands. And 1 in 4 of those women who are currently entering our system are either pregnant or mothers to children under the age of 1. So we're not just talking about an epidemic of incarcerated women, but also, we have to consider their children. And so we are now seeing more reforms specifically tailored to incarcerated women. And I'll give a plug for my home state. Again, Senator Julie Rocky Adams has a bill that's going to be voted on the Senate floor tomorrow, Senate Bill 133. So if you guys are on the Twitter machine, you can say thanks to her for pushing this bill. If you get an opportunity to watch the hearing in the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, which was very interesting that it didn't go through judiciary, because we are now looking at this as a public health crisis, and I think that we should. But if you get a chance to watch that hearing, I encourage you to do so, because it was interesting.
Yeah. Mark, I want to ask, you spend, as the SVP of Koch Industries, you spend a fair amount of time talking with colleagues in the corporate world, in the business world,
Yeah.
About criminal justice. And you have taken this on as a business prerogative. I'm curious, what are you hearing? What is the investment from the business community in this issue? For your
Well, I mean, it's interesting. At Koch, I've been with the company 23 years, and for 23 years, we've hired people with criminal records. In the last several years, we banned the box. We removed the box from our employment application, and we defer the discussion about a criminal record until we have an offer of employment, a conditional offer of employment out there, and then we do a background check. And what we've learned through that process over the years is that a criminal record is one data point. It's basically what the EEOC said for years, that you should consider that data point. You should consider a lot of data points in whoever you hire. That's one data point. How long ago did it happen? What was the offense? What's the person like now? And so from our experience, it's always been a positive. You need to be careful who you hire, regardless of whether they have a record or not. And in the past 4 or 5 years, we've been more and more vocal about it, as there's been more and more attention put on this whole issue, criminal justice reform in particular. And most employers, we have discussions with them one at a time, they're open to it. You have to talk to them about it and explain what it is and what it isn't. That's always important, what it isn't. You're going to make sure you're prioritizing safety for sure at all times, and make sure you're hiring the right people. You need to do that with every person you hire. And we've had it in Wichita, Kansas, where I used to spend most of my time. I've talked to a bunch of people one-on-one, and they've started to hire people. My colleagues do the same thing. And it's one person at a time. Just find one person at a time, hire that person, and then hire another person, just like anything else. I will say, with the way the economy, thankfully, is hopefully picking up and booming, and there's a huge labor shortage in this country, I think that there's more and more appetite by employers to hire people with criminal records. If the statistics are somewhere 1/3 or so of the people in this country, adults, have some type of criminal record. So for us at Koch, it always never made sense to exclude potentially 1/3 of the potential workforce just because of a criminal record. Because we got 120,000 employees, global employer, we want the best people, period, not those with or without a criminal record. And I think more and more employers are seeing that you can't get just, say, 1/3 of the workforce we're not going to look at, because there's such especially for skilled labor, a lack of that in industry. And what we've seen is more and more people are open to it, and it's mutual benefit, basically. The employer needs someone. There are people now skilled with prison reform in certain places like Michigan and other states coming out qualified to do the work. And there's like 6 million jobs, that need welders, electricians, that type of thing, that go wanting every year. So I think it's one of these issues, the more people talk about it, the more you socialize it out there, the more they get to meet people who have criminal records and have a background in it, and they see they're just regular folks. Speak for myself, I easily could have been caught up in the system. Luckily, I was on the other side of the bars when I worked in the prison. And then over time, people will change their minds about it, but I think you can't force it. The government can't force it on private employers because that'll turn them off. If the government wants to help, it needs to reduce the number of collateral consequences that keep people from jobs and occupational licenses and things like that.
Yeah. Now, Larry, you hear from a constituency that certainly in this room is a bit rarer, more elusive. You hear from a community of our AUSAs, of federal prosecutors, who feel that the emphasis on sentencing reform certainly at the federal level, but obviously more broadly, is somewhat misguided. That in fact, enforcement and prosecutorial discretion here is a key tool in keeping America safe and enhancing public safety across the U.S. And I'm curious, given the gravity, the trajectory that this conversation has taken over the past couple of years, where do you see that perspective gaining traction, and why?
About less than 7% of our federal prisoners are women, less than 7%. We have about 28 juveniles currently serving a federal sentence. This is one of the distinctions that separates us from the state system and the federal system. We are not prosecuting low-level, nonviolent drug users. We are not prosecuting juveniles. I have to go to the Attorney General to prosecute a juvenile and get the Attorney General to sign off on the authorization before we do so. Those are the kinds of crimes that are prosecuted at the state level. We've heard a lot about the success of these state systems. We've done some research recently on recidivism. Recidivism is the gold standard. If your system works well, your recidivism rate should be low. The recidivism rate at the federal system, 3 years out, after you're released for a 3-year period, how many people in the federal system get rearrested? It's about 34%. Should be zero in a perfect world. We'd like it to be zero. There's about 5,600 assistant United States attorneys. If they had that magic wand, when a person finished serving his sentence, we'd tap him and say, you'll never commit another crime again. That would be wonderful. But that's not the reality of the world that we live in. When you look at the state systems who are touting better programs, you have to ask yourself, what is your rearrest recidivism rate 3 years and out? And the states that we've studied, the so-called model states, don't come anywhere near the 34% that we achieve at the federal level. And their systems cost more. So our position as federal prosecutors is our system's working well. We should continue to do what we're doing. As far as the statutory prosecution, you've asked about how are we doing with the system we currently have. The system we currently have has done extraordinarily well. We had a crime epidemic back in the 80s that was just horrendous. And the Congress of the United States addressed that by creating new statutes, new tools for prosecutors to use. And as a result of that, our crime rate plummeted. Did our incarceration rate increase? Yes, because we're prosecuting people who deserve to be prosecuted for the crimes they committed. You've got to keep in mind that the major goal of our criminal justice system is not only prosecuting people who commit crime. The major goal is to protect the innocent and to protect the public safety. We think at the federal level, we do that very well. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. Should we tweak some things and make them better? Absolutely. But for the most part, facts show that our crime rate has plummeted as a result of some of the things that we have, the tools that we currently have, including mandatory minimums, I know that's a hot topic, that have worked very, very well for us over the years.
So a big part of what we've heard in each of your answers is a very different framing of success, what it looks like, who it's for. We've heard from Mark, the surfeit of employers across the country who are seeking candidates, people to fill jobs, and actually have a scarcity of people because, again, 1 in 4 people in prison across the world is in prison in the U.S. Why in that problem, we heard from Holley, some of the collateral consequences include the consequences of, for example, dignity for women. One version of success that one could construe is that everyone feels their dignity enhanced. Why center the point of solution on rearrest rates? What do you think? There are many components, of course, to public safety, but what's the argument for making your definition of success here a stronger definition of success than, say, the number of people who are currently behind bars who could be in jobs?
Well, you have to have some way of measuring how your system is working. And the gold standard in the industry, if you will, of criminology is what's your recidivism rate, either 3 years out or 5 years out or 8 years out. And it's based upon, should be based upon rearrest. What some of the state systems do is they don't look at rearrest, they only look at reconvictions. When you look at just reconvictions, that drives the number lower, and it makes it look like you're having a successful program when in fact that's not the case. You know, one of the things we have to recognize is that there's nothing that we're going to be able to do as far as our criminal justice is concerned that's going to eliminate the real problem. And the real problem doesn't begin when you get arrested. The real problem begins before you're arrested. We need to figure out ways of what we can do to try to convince people that they should choose a law-abiding way of life. What incentives can we have out there to fix the problem before it, quite frankly, starts? And when we do that, then we're going to go a long way to fixing the ultimate problem that we're talking about today.
And if we could spend less money on throwing people behind bars, we could invest more money in education and economic development, infrastructure improvements, areas where if we were investing more resources, perhaps we wouldn't see as many people entering our justice system. But if we are going to talk about this in the context of public safety, I do want to throw out a statistic. Over the past decade, the 10 states that have most significantly reduced their incarcerated populations through the reforms that Mark and I support saw an average drop in their crime rates of 19%. Conversely, the 10 states that most significantly increased their incarcerated populations through the old, tough on crime, lock them up and throw away the key policies of the 1980s, only saw an average drop in crime of 11%. So, I think the strong argument for reform is that it does make our community safer.
Can I just chime in? And I don't want to, I have a lot of respect for Larry and what he does, but I have to just make one note. I know I haven't looked recently, but a few years ago, there were over 2,200 people who were sentenced to federal prison for simple possession. Those sound like low-level nonviolent offenders.
That's not an accurate number, Mark. About 4%.
I have the data
I
downstairs.
don't know where you're getting it from. About 4%
So I guess
of
to-
our
Getting it
inmates.
from the Bureau of Justice Statistics.
Since I sadly don't have a live fact checker in front of me right now, I guess the question is how much is how many nonviolent
Right. And all I'm saying is there are in the system, I think, but let's put that aside. Mandatory minimums, I was around when they started, obviously. I think that I've heard, that's what led to the reduction in the crime rate. I've talked to prosecutors who I respect a lot who say maybe 30%. That was the reason why it dropped. There are other factors. So I think saying just because there were long sentences, that's what drove it, I don't think that's right. I think a lot of it, and I lived in D.C., I lived in Worcester. I saw a lot of things with drugs over the years in that era. I understand what drove it. It was bipartisan. It was good intentioned. But I do think that we probably overshot on it, and that's why I'd say that even though Larry says the states are different, what they're doing is what we should try to do at the federal level as well, I think, is divert people out. Right now we can't. We don't have specialty courts, obviously, and I don't know if that would ever happen. I do know I was at the White House last September, and there were a couple of representatives from the Department of Justice. There was a great discussion with advocates, elected officials, and others, and one of the discussion points that the DOJ seemed interested in was maybe specialty courts, like keeping people out of the system. That would be sentencing reform, and that's worked in the states. Does it work all the time? No, but it's a tool we should use to try to differentiate and keep people out if we can. And by saying all this, I'm not saying anyone's done anything wrong in the system up till now, right? I'm just saying we know better. We've learned a lot, and we've seen what works in different places in different states with different approaches. And whether it's okay, so someone gets out of prison or doesn't go to prison to begin with, great. There's someone who's going to be in prison, absolutely. They'll need to be there for a long time. But we then need to do something with them when they're there. to Holly's point on education, I mean, one of the things that can level the playing field for anybody, regardless of socioeconomic status, is a good education. But we know that's a big problem in a lot of places. So my point of view is the things that generally keep you out of prison to begin with are someone, hopefully a family member that loves you and mentors you, a job, an opportunity, and an education. But if people don't get that and they end up in prison, they definitely need it upon reentry, and that's why we're really focused on prison reform and reentry reform. You need all those things to succeed. It's not a secret. And those that do get it, in prison, education programs, the study shows, by a DOJ study, by the way, that for every dollar spent on in-prison education, you defray $4 of incarceration costs. It works.
So Larry, I want to give you an opportunity to respond, and then I want to double
Yeah.
down on something or reinforce something that I heard implicit in your question.
Well, education, I think, is key. This is the inmate's prison record of the courses that the Federal Bureau of Prison has offered this one inmate. And I'm not going to be able to read all 4 pages. Just to give you a sense, these are the programs this inmate was exposed to. HAVC, self-study, residential wiring, self-study, computer skills, fair job intervention, your strategic future, keyboarding, self-study, job survey, computer lab, French 2, classic Western movies, history of the world, comedy film study, medicine ball, stretching, fair health, legendary adventures. I could go on and on. So this idea that we put people up in the federal system and lock them in a cell and give them bread and water is just a fallacy. We do everything we can to try to really rehabilitate. Yes, you have to be punished for committing a crime. For every crime, there's a victim, or many victims if you're a drug trafficker, maybe thousands of victims. This idea that we're going to focus on the criminals, it's a good idea. We should do the best we can to rehabilitate people, but we can't forget that they're there for a reason, and they victimize people, and we need not to lose the reality that there's a consequence to the crime these people commit. Again, what we need to do is stop people from committing crime. Once they've committed that crime, yes, we should rehabilitate them. We should do everything we can so they won't commit crime again, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons does that. 18 months before you're released as a federal prisoner, they begin a process to get you back in society. 6 months before you're released, you go to a halfway house to get you a job, to get you a place to live. After your sentence is over, you're on a period of supervised relief where you have a U.S. probation officer who works with you for 3 to 5 years to continue to assure, as best we can, that this person does not go back to a life of crime. We fail 34% of the time, unfortunately, 3 years out.
We can dive in quite a bit on the question of how do we make the experience for folks who are caught up in the broad system of correctional observation in the U.S., how do we make that experience one that does not essentially trap them in that system? We can talk about that for some time, but I hear something implicit in your line of questioning, Larry, that I want to tease out, because I also even hear reformers beginning to ask versions of this question, which is, are we just talking about the low-hanging fruit? Are we just, in talking about, particularly when we talk about nonviolent drug offenses, are we dancing around the much larger question of what is America to do with all of the people who are currently in the carceral state? Especially violent criminals. We will come to a point in this conversation, where if Holley and Mark, if your efforts succeed, where we will have somewhat addressed the harsh, perhaps over-harsh sentencing of drug offenders. But what happens then if the majority of folks who are behind bars at the state and local level are there for offenses that include violence? What's the argument to the public? How will we actually make Americans productive and send them off to jobs and education with that reality?
Well, and to Larry's point, I'd just like to say the reforms we favor are pro-crime survivor and pro-victim, pro-community, pro-law enforcement, pro-family. That's what we're about. We're not about trying to coddle criminals or anything else. We're trying to make them better people, hopefully over time with some of the programs we're going to talk about. But to your point, I mean, the bottom line is that whether people like it or not, more than 95% of the people in the system come out. They're all coming out. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And so we as a society have to decide, do we want them coming out better or worse? And that gets back to the programmatic activity and prison reform, which at the federal level, there seems to be a lot of consensus on right now. And I'd like more, but I also would like to get something done. So what we need to do is hopefully make reforms so some of the people are staying out who aren't a risk to public safety and can be dealt with less consequentially and from an economic perspective and a human cost perspective by putting them and locking them up, because we know over time people get more violent if they're in prison, even if they weren't to begin with. So trying to keep people out will help. But your point's the big point. There's a lot of people with violent felonies, dangerous felonies, but people can change. It's a tougher sell, for sure, with the American public, and I get that. But that's why we need prison reform. That's why we need reforms where people get educated, people learn skills, people get drug treatment, people get therapy, if it's faith-based, whatever it is. We work with groups that, and the list you read was great, absolutely, a lot of good stuff in there. But we work with groups that are, I don't know if they're non-traditional, they're nonprofits for sure, like Defy Ventures, for example. It's a prison entrepreneurship program and fellowship program. It goes to the most dangerous prisons, Pelican Bay Supermax in California. I was up there last summer, and they've got these really violent, people accused of violent crimes who are in there for a long time, working together across gang lines productively. And some of them are getting out and getting jobs. They have entrepreneurial skills. You know, we work with Hudson Link, which is a great education program. Prison Fellowship, a great program. There's all these different programs out there. And one of the things I want to talk about real quickly, not to monopolize the time, is I'm really lucky to work at Koch. And we're very lucky to partner with a lot of groups, including Holley's group, but with Right on Crime and the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we are starting, and have started, Safe Streets and Second Chances, which we think is going to hopefully be a game changer in reentry reform in this country and reentry in general. It's right now in 4 states, 4 pilot states. We hope to scale it up. And the whole idea is that someone else said it in the earlier session, reentry needs to begin day 1 of incarceration. Day 1, not 6 months out, not 18 months out. And it needs to be a mindset. And our hope is with the tools we're going to bring, working in these state facilities, there's going to be 30 facilities in 4 states, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and Pennsylvania to start with, showing that, and it's going to be randomized, so it'll be violent, nonviolent, everything, that we can hopefully reduce the recidivism rate over time through these programs that make people better. And we'll see what happens. The groups we work with now, the ones I mentioned, they have recidivism rates on a small scale between 2%, 5%, 8%. So if you can scale that up, I'm not saying we can, that could be remarkable and a game changer.
Holley, what do you think is the most needed intervention to make any encounter with the criminal justice system not a trap?
I mean, look, I think we've got to be focusing more on treatment. And I know we talk a lot about how reforms save money, and that's great. But we've got to start putting, this is where a lot of the prosecutors have really been wonderful to work with, because they are deep believers in treatment, and we just don't have enough opportunities for treatment. I mean, I come from a state, Kentucky. I know you guys thought I was from Connecticut, but I come from a state where everybody's sick. Everybody's sick. And I want to say something about, we keep talking about these people, the criminals, the people who break the law. I mean, I come from a family, my dad was a doctor, my mom was a stay-at-home mom and basically a stalker. I mean, I had every privilege that a child could have, basically a perfect upbringing. I've struggled with alcohol abuse my entire life. My brother, 6'6", gorgeous, a basketball superstar. I hated him growing up. You know, he had a serious brain injury and had surgery. And then he became addicted to the pain medication that they gave him. So we're all in this together. Let's be very clear. So I just want to be careful. I just want to be very careful, how we talk about these people, because it's us,
There is, at a certain point, when I was talking with a fellow journalist in the newsroom, we were talking about the fact that in particular neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and we were talking about Milwaukee, he had said his parents had told him he was thinking of going to school in the University of Wisconsin system, and that his mom had sat him down at one point and said no, because for black men of our age, 1 out of every 2 of us would be pulled under some sort of correctional observation. So either it was going to be him or me, one of the 2 of us would have been in carceral observation. And so I think there is one of the strange dimensions of the spread of this problem, as we've been talking about it, is that it is very concentrated in some areas, and that there are some folks who have almost no sight line into it at all. And I'm curious, from your perspective, Larry, to come back to you, what is the, you've talked a lot about the prevention of reentry, but what would you do if you had, if you could control a state budget, and someone were to ask you the question, which is a question that a lot of governors get asked, do you put that extra dollar into better prosecution, more enforcement? Do you put that extra dollar into making the experience of incarceration better, more enriching? Or do you put that extra dollar into getting naloxone into the hands of folks who can connect it to someone who's getting overdosed? Where would you put that extra dollar?
I would put that extra dollar in doing everything we can to try to convince people not to lead lives of crime. The tragedy in our
So
society
is that communication and marketing? Is that education?
whatever it takes. We need to focus on that. We need to focus on crime prevention. We need to create an environment where people no longer turn to crime. You know, one of the tragedies in our country is that our minority communities are the most victimized by criminals. And it's a tragedy that we need to somehow fix so that your other person there wouldn't be looking at the possibility of going to jail just because of his race. We need to fix that. That's what I do with
At
the
the same
dollar.
time, we are right now in the midst of another drug epidemic, the way that we were in the 80s when harsher sentences, many of them in many places, went into effect. Right now, states are considering this question. Is the opioid epidemic a public health emergency, or is it a matter of criminal enforcement? And it's a matter of dollars and cents for a lot of jurisdictions. Where do you put those dollars and cents? Now, at this stage when we could intervene, is the criminal justice system the best place to invest?
I don't think it's the best place, but it's certainly one of the places. The things that's worked for us in the past are the things we want to continue to use. Is it going to solve the problem? No. 64,000 of our citizens died in 2016 as a result of the opioid heroin epidemic. We as prosecutors are simply trying to stem the tide of prosecuting those people who traffic in drugs to make money. They sell a poison to our citizens for profit. Those are the people we prosecute. 4%, according to the Sentencing Commission, 4% of our prosecutions are for possession. And those 4%, about half of that comes from my brothers and sisters who are prosecutors on our state borders with Mexico, who capture people coming in with 60, 70 pounds of marijuana, and there's so many of them, they downplay it to a simple possession. The other possession cases, if you're in a federal park, you're driving down a federal highway, and you happen to have a joint, and you get stopped for speeding, yeah, you're going to get a possession for marijuana. But we put those people in diversion programs. They don't end up at the end of the day. We have pretrial diversion programs in the federal system. So if you're committing a de minimis crime like the possession of a joint, at the end of the day, you're going to get no record. You're going to be put on probation for a year, and then it will go away. So we do a lot of good things in our federal system, and we need to continue doing those. But no matter what we do as prosecutors, until we face the issue of what are we doing to keep people from leading a life of crime, we're always going to be in the mess we're in right now.
So we need to give them alternatives. Need to be jobs, need to be education. That's what we need. And look, I'm not excusing any criminal conduct, but the reality is people have to survive sometimes, and they do things that they probably shouldn't do, but they do them. And I think that the fact that we know where a lot of these, at least I'm going to speak from, again, it's 100 years ago in Worcester, Massachusetts, it was a bunch of poor white kids locked up who were poorly educated, didn't have any supervision. They ended up in the system. I'm not excusing it in any way. They did these things. But there's a reason this keeps happening again and again and again. And I don't think that we need to keep fighting it with the same tools. I think that, I hate to say it this way, but the war on drugs, drugs won. I mean, that's just the reality. So we need to treat it, there is a criminal element, definitely treat it like that, but there's something much more deeply lying underneath it, particularly for the people who end up, I'm not saying the dealers, but the people who are addicted. I'm glad we're not going to take the same approach we did with crack, treating it like a criminal issue. I hope people can get treatment and help and have fulfilling lives, but there's got to be opportunities out there. It's a lack, right now I think a lot of it's a lack of hope. That's both out there and in prisons. I mean, so hopefully we can provide some hope, and I think that there's a lot we can do as a society to enhance and protect public safety with the great work that U.S. attorneys do and all the prosecutors, because like Holley said, we're all in this together. We all want the same thing.
Thank you for that, Mark. And I heard many points of at least possible tentative agreement among the three of you, and I know that there is a much broader universe of issues to dive into more deeply, and so thank you. Mark, Holley, Larry, thank you for
Matt.
your time today, and
Good
thanks
job.
to all of you.
Thank you.